Good morning. My name is Jean Abinader. I work at the Moroccan American Center. Thank you for coming. I wanted to point out a couple things before the program starts. One is Lassan Haddad, who is coming from the parliament, who's re-elected to the parliament, is in negotiations as a member of the popular movement with the new government. So he couldn't come. We hope his party do well in the negotiations and looking forward to that outcome. Second thing is we want to introduce our new website, Morocco on the Move. It's also a blog and our Twitter, Morocco on the Move. So you can follow what we're doing on Morocco. The program will be on it this morning, and we look forward to having a great exchange. And with that, I want to introduce Ed Gabriel, former U.S. Ambassador to Morocco, who will be the moderator of the program. Ed?
Good morning, everyone, to all of our friends that are here. Many of you are Morocco experts, so I hope that we can live up to a high standard in your opinion. I'm not going to go over the bios of each person because they were handed out at the beginning of the at the table out front. As Jean said, I'm Ed Gabriel. I was the U.S. ambassador to Morocco from 97 to 2001 during the transition from King Hassan to King Mohammed, the current leader. And it was a very interesting time, as you can imagine, to go from the era of King Hassan to King Mohammed. Some of that we'll talk about today as it affects the constitutional process and our topic today on the elections. I also advise the Kingdom of Morocco, although today my opinions are my own, and they don't necessarily represent the opinions of Morocco. The format that we're going to follow is as follows. I'm going to ask each person one question. I'm going to ask them to spend 5 minutes on that question. And then I'm going to ask the other panelists to spend 1 or 2 minutes commenting or further refining the answer of the person answering the question. And then I'll go to each person after that. So we'll go through the 4 panelists in that format. And following that, in about 50 minutes, 45, 50 minutes, we will open up for questions and comments to the group. Let me just make a couple of comments. One is that Morocco has been spared the disruption and the conflicts that we've seen in some of the other countries. And we have to ask ourselves several questions about why is that. But one of them that is very obvious is that this king, King Mohammed VI, has a very good relationship with the people in the country. There was an unofficial poll done a couple of years ago, an illegal unofficial poll by a reputable international firm. And although the palace didn't appreciate polls being done, the king got a 96% approval rating in his country. So I think there's a strong connection between the monarch, this particular monarch, and the citizens. The Constitution also compares with that of other countries in Europe, especially Spain. We've been looking at the Constitution of Spain line for line, and we see a lot of similarities with the Spanish Constitution, which we believe starts to bode well for this king wanting to become, quote, as he said, the citizen king. Now, how is this going to play out in the coming months? I wish we knew. Maybe our panelists will give us some insight into that. One is we've got, following the elections, a party, the PJD, the Islamist party in Morocco, which won about a quarter of the seats of the parliament and will be, it looks like, the ruling, head of the ruling coalition of a new government. So the question is, how will they take this new constitution and implement it and push the reform and transition forward? The second question, of course, is what role is the palace going to play in that transition? And will the Constitution be able to play itself out in a free and friendly manner? In that sense, I think we've seen some of the initial moves by the palace, the king himself, very quickly appointing Ben Karan as the prime minister and staying out of a lot of the other issues that is in front of the government today. So I think that they're off to a very good start in that sense. there's a lot that this country is going to face today. Any of you who may be skeptical about the changes going on in Morocco, all you have to do is ask any number of people that are currently in government in Morocco, and they would tell you it's for real. Many of them are out looking for jobs right now, and it's a big change in the country, and it's something that they're going to have to face with a lot of new thinking, and through the transition, they're going to have to come up with new ideas of implementation. They're going to go through regionalization. They're going to have a new human rights and civil rights documents. They're going to go through power sharing, an independent judiciary, and many other kinds of changes. So it's not going to be easy for Morocco, but it seems like at the top they're very dedicated to this change. Our first speaker is going to be Anwar Bukhara, who is a known author on Morocco, and he's at McDaniel College as a professor. Anwar, let me ask you the first question. There seems to be some question in the media about Morocco's commitment to the reforms. Can you give us your perceptions on how these elections and the new constitution are viewed in Morocco? You were there recently and you're going back. Is this a move forward, or as some would say, business as usual?
Thank you, Ambassador. I mean, it's a move forward. I mean, the ongoing transformation in Morocco has already ushered in several positive developments. So, first one, Islamists winning free and fair elections in Morocco should not come as a surprise, but their victory constitutes a clean break from how elections used to be perceived by the electorate, number one, and two, by the political elites themselves. Before, obviously, people used to vote when they do vote based on which political party is close to the palace, for example. That's no longer the case, and that's the win of the PGD demonstrates to us today. So the election will lead political parties to understand, and this is very important, that their survival no longer depends on their proximity to the palace. The voters in this election had made the best selection choice they had. The PGD, in my view, represented the only feasible outlet for any Moroccan that was unhappy with the socio-economic conditions of the country, with the prevailing economic policies of the outgoing government. Second, the Moroccan political landscape seemed to be, at least in the last decade, bereft of clear ideological commitments. There has become no difference between rightist parties, parties in the center, and parties in the left. Now we are seeing some change, positive change, right? We will have a political landscape that is clearly defined, right? Ideologically and also politically. The Socialist Party has refused the offer of the PGD to join the government. Some saw it as a positive move, some as negative move. I personally wish if they had joined the government based on political consideration and not ideological considerations. Nevertheless, we will probably have a conservative bloc, and then a leftist bloc, and then a liberal bloc. And that's healthy in a democracy. You can't have a democracy unless you have a well-defined political landscape and political parties with well-defined and distinct ideologies. So the real important change in Morocco is not just the win of a moderate Islamist party, but the fact that Islamists, for the first time obviously, or any political party for the first time, will share executive power and will be subjected for the first time to the unforgiving test of incumbency. So both the monarchy and the Islamists gained from the results. That's the best scenario for the palace that the PJD won, and for the Islamists as well. So by appointing Ben Kiran as a head of government, prime minister, the king showed that he was holding firm to his commitments and to the new constitution. Very important. The Islamists too, they have always aspired, at least since 1998, to reach government, to work within the system to change the system. So both the Islamists and the monarchy, they have an opening right now for shared governance, and both of them have a stake that the reforms win, because it's true Morocco has weathered the storm quite successfully, but there are enormous challenges that needs to be confronted, mainly economics, in terms of economics, and in terms of corruption. Unless those are addressed, then the country is bound to experience serious trouble as we move forward.
Thank you, Anwar. Does anyone want to offer a comment or ask Anwar a question?
Yeah, I think these elections also occur against a backdrop of waning interest in politics and a cynicism regarding Moroccan institutions. I was part of a study, a MEPI grant, that launched a pre-election poll in the 2007 elections, and there's a great deal of concern about the ability of Moroccan parties to represent the interests of the Moroccan people, the ability of Moroccan parties to behave in a way that's autonomous, as well as a general concern as to whether or not the government was interested in some of the more basic issues that people face on a daily basis. So I think for these elections to have happened at all is significant, and that they have happened in a way that's nonviolent, and that they have happened in a way that has provided a more open political space for various political actors and parties is significant, I think, for the monarchy. In addition, I think the elections are a win in the sense that they have occurred, and also that the PJD has been successful. So I think the monarchy has gone forward in a way that's very positive. I think that the tradition of reform in the country has been somewhat of a strong one, although there have been some complaints that those earlier reforms have not gone far enough. But I think there is a very cautious optimism that the monarchy will implement substantive reforms as opposed to cosmetic reforms, which has been the trend in the past.
I would agree with everything that's been said. I think we need to look a little bit at the numbers. I don't think there's a mandate here at all. The number of people that voted was about 45% of the registered voters. But the number of registered voters in this election was about 2 million people less than in 2007. There's also the protest movement, the February 20th movement, and some of the smaller political parties that were actually protesting this election. And as we observed, although not scientific, there was a significant amount of the votes that were cast to be protest ballots. So I think there is a significant number of people in society who've not bought into the elections, who are skeptical. We heard that skepticism and cynicism on the street during the week of the election. And I think while it's significant and important that the reforms have been made, that the PJD won, I think they have a great challenge to actually deliver in a very short period of time.
Bob?
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on the theme of protest voting. As you said before, Ed, I mean, it's not as though there are polls available in Morocco to do a good analysis of what people were voting for or why they voted for this party or that one. But anecdotally, I think, one of the conclusions that I've drawn from watching the election is that PJD's victory is, in a sense, both a victory for themselves and a defeat for the other parties in a way in which I think is actually positive for them. Because I think that a lot of people voted for PJD not necessarily because they shared the Islamic reference that PJD says it has, but because they were unhappy with the inability of the other parties in the country to deliver on the kinds of basic goods and services that people are interested in. So I think that, in a sense, while PJD's victory may seem like a defeat for the other parties, it could have a very positive consequence in the sense that the sort of road to victory that PJD has traced should prove a positive motivation for other parties in the country to try to model themselves on the sort of seriousness of the PJD's approach to politics, and hopefully we'll see some changes in the other political parties in the future in an attempt for them to recapture their portion of the electorate, which presumably would also lend itself to encouraging greater voter participation in the process as a whole.
Anwar, thanks, Bob. Anwar, we're throwing around the term Islamist party. How does this Islamist party differ to the Islamist party in Tunisia, the Islamist parties in Europe? And recently I made the comment, and you can dispute it if you'd like, that this Islamist party is, to me, seems much more akin to the Christian Democrats of Europe than it does with, quote, the Islamist party that you might equate in Tunisia and Egypt. Would you care to comment on that?
Absolutely right, and that's how they describe themselves. At least that's how they claim they are. There are similarities with Nahda in Tunisia. I mean, when Nahda won, the first thing that the PJD did is that they sent Al-Thmani #2 to Tunisia the next day to congratulate them. The PJD sees itself as similar to the Turkish, the same name. Party of Justice and Development, though the PJD claims, or it states that the Turkish Islamists, they have been inspired by the Moroccan brand of Islamism, because it's the Moroccan Islamists that coined their name, and then the Turks followed it, and they called it too Party of Justice and Development. So. But you are absolutely right. Though the PJD itself is not a monolith, it's very important to remember that. I mean, there are at least 3 groups within the PJD, and that's one of the challenges of this new government that they will head. The challenges are more internal than external, is how they will be responsive to different constituencies. There is a current, there is a religious current, dawah, missionary. There is a pragmatic current represented by elected officials, and then there is a reformist current within the youth that want to deepen, obviously, the process quickly. So how do you square with the PJD's youth and these differences is going to be a huge challenge. But the PJD obviously is moderate, has always been moderate, and it has stated that, in fact, if you look at its campaign, it does not mention Islam at all. The only time it mentions it comes in, there are 5 priorities. It's only in priority 4 that it talks about Islam, and only then Islam as a reference. Islam as social justice, that's what they say. Islam would, the values of Islam would enable them to combat corruption, and that's the extent of it. They're not, but the Islamists, even in Tunisia, I mean, they're not stupid. They understand that people's grievances are socioeconomic and also are political, and I agree with you. I mean, people voted for the PJD not because of their Islamist brand. It was mostly a protest movement against the rest, and they want just to try something new. So yeah, I mean, it's going to be an economic challenge, and in any case, the Constitution says that the religion is the preview of the monarch, and it's clear.
And the king, it also acknowledges the king as the commander of the faithful.
Absolutely right.
Which is very different from some of these other countries. Audra Grant is a political scientist at RAND. And a former professor at El Ahwain University, a university that I've had a lot of dealings with and admire a great deal. Audra, the question for you is as follows. There seems to be a great deal of concern based on statements by the leadership of Ennahda inside Tunisia and the transitional government in Libya and the Islamist parties of Egypt that women will not fare well under the governments with a strong Islamic orientation. based on your research, is the situation different in Morocco, and what are the implications of the election for women in Morocco? Are we looking at progress or a step backwards?
Thank you, Ambassador Gabriel. I think the promise of transition in North Africa has indeed raised a number of important expectations among women that, potential liberalization will extend to their community. And women have been indeed very important agents of change in these Arab Spring transitions. They have blogged, they have provided services, they have marched, they have protested, and in some cases even fought alongside their male counterparts. So I think, in terms of where women stand now, it can range, or their status can range somewhere between precarious to very promising. And I think Morocco could potentially fall on the very promising end of that spectrum. If we look at some of the efforts and measures that have been implemented to improve the status of women in recent years in Morocco, we can just look back to the 2004 reforms of the Personal Status Code, which seeks to redress and deal with the status of the woman in the household and by extension her community. Personal status codes address issues of guardianship, inheritance, custody, and lineage and these sorts of things, as well as property rights. In Morocco in 2004, those status codes were reformed in a way that was much more liberalizing and in a way that looks much more like Tunisia's codes. Now women have more of a say in guardianship, and they attain that status at 21 years old. They can also inherit and have greater rights in terms of custody and on issues of polygamy. There are also substantial restrictions that prevent women from being divorced very easily and these sorts of things. So there have been significant strides there. Also on the electoral front, more recently, following the July 1st constitutional referendum, women's rights are now enshrined. And there is recognition of gender equality, not just in terms of political and civil rights, but also economic and environmental and cultural rights as well. So that's very important for women. There's also been an increase in the number of seats allowed for women from 30 to 60 seats, thereby propelling parties to have a greater role in ensuring greater female participation in the political spectrum. So I think Morocco is certainly moving forward in those respects. I think the concern is whether or not those changes will actually translate into practice. I think the challenge for the new government, again, is to implement meaningful reforms regarding women. And then Morocco can be, I think, a model in the North African region in this issue area. But again, the challenge is really implementing substantive reforms regarding women. It's been a challenge from the standpoint of changing attitudes and in changing years of entrenched practices. So I think going forward, training for women's organizations and women-led parties, I think pushing the government to implement those regulations and policies regarding women will be key in the future in terms of giving women greater legislative access and ensuring greater political participation.
Thank you. I'm reminded when the king took the throne upon the death of his father, 3 weeks after his father's death at the Youth Day, August 20th, he said in his very first public speech, how can our country move forward when half of the population, its women, are disenfranchised? So I think it speaks to one of his great concerns. Shortly thereafter, of course, he was also called King of the Poor. But I think it's becoming defining on some of the issues he personally cares about and that he intends to improve. How do you feel about these issues, Sherry? And would you like to offer a comment or two?
Well, I think that enshrining some of these women's issues in the Constitution is a huge step forward. And the increase in the number of seats in Parliament for women is very, very important. We're institutionally at NDI, we're a little skeptical of the long-term impact of set-aside seats for women because oftentimes women who take seats through these special measures become marginalized in the real political discourse in a legislature. And it also doesn't require the parties to necessarily bring in women into their own internal political process. It's very easy to just say, we're going to encourage women, but just for those special seats. So I think more will need to be done to ensure that these women who are going in are actually a valid part of the discussion and lawmaking when they get into Parliament.
Great, thank you. Bob, would you?
Yeah, I would. I want to just pick up on that last point.
I'm sorry about the music in between.
Nice.
Yeah. My comment become more lighthearted. First of all, I want to say that I share your views, and I have a great deal of admiration for the courage and the conviction of women in Morocco, many of whom I've worked with from the time that I was at the embassy there and since then, for the leadership that they have shown in organizing Morocco's civil society around advocacy on a whole range of issues that I would sort of call social justice kinds of issues. Their courage in doing that, I think, has been really extraordinary. But I want to talk about women in Parliament. I have the privilege, I think, of knowing quite a number of them. And I understand NDI's concern about the institutionalization of set-aside seats for women in legislative bodies, but the ones I know are not likely to be marginalized because they've shown the same kind of courage and conviction in their actions in Parliament, I think, that they've shown in civil society. I do agree very much with your comments about how the political parties have responded to that in terms of opening the party leadership structure itself to women who are in the party. That's a place where I think they have been most resistant and a place I think that really needs to be changed. I agree entirely with that comment.
It reminds me of another thing. I think those of you who've been to Morocco and worked in Morocco will also witness another thing, and that is this king early on formed bonds and relationships with civil society. He, it seemed as though he was actually reaching beyond government
beyond
to civil
parties.
society to drive them at the local level to demand more good governance. But when you look at civil society, a large part of it is driven by women in Morocco as well. Anwar, do you care to speak on this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are powerful feminist movements in Morocco. In fact, Ben Kiran, I mean, the current prime minister, I mean, he felt it necessary to go and meet with them. I mean, prior to election, he met with several feminist organizations in which he addressed them, and he addressed some of their concerns. So yeah, they're going to be a pressure group, a lobby group, which is healthy, obviously, to keep this government in line with what the Constitution stipulates. For the quota, I totally agree. The problem is that if there is no quota, as of yet, women don't fare very well. I mean, if you look at the results, unfortunately, you know, I think outside the 60, it's only 3 or 4 women that won their seats, and we're looking at 11% right now in the legislature. So, yeah, I mean, as we move forward, it's just you want to ingrain that culturally that you have to vote for women. Also, the Constitution, an important addition to it, states that political parties now are obliged or obligated to reserve about 1/3 of positions in the leadership to women regionally and nationally. So that's a positive move forward as I see it, but there are still obviously challenges ahead, but I share your concerns.
Thank you, Anwar. I'd now like to ask Sherry Bryan to speak. She's vice president at NDI and also was the co-leader of the observer delegation during the Moroccan election, so she's just back from Morocco. Our question to you is the following. NDI spent time in Morocco before, during, and after the elections, and before at least stretches back to my era when NDI actually established an office and began working with the parliament and the political parties. Given your team's experience, your long experience, how would you characterize the election process this time, and how does Morocco continue to make progress in holding elections in the future?
I think the election process itself was or quite good, but somewhat unremarkable. There was, when we arrived there a week before, we had a team of 40 observers. 10 of them were long-term observers. They were in the country for 2 months, so observing the month before and the month after the election. But when we arrived the week before the election, it was really hard to tell that there was an election about to take place. Nobody was talking about it. There were no political posters up in the streets. There was very little in the news. And so it seemed like sort of a non-event. And I think that kind of plays into the skepticism about this election. The election day went off really without a hitch for the most part. There was no allegations or findings of ballot stuffing or irregularities that would have changed the outcome. The management of the election was quite good. It's still managed by the Ministry of Interior. I think one of the things in the long term that the government should think about, we've recommended this in the past, is that an independent election commission be created. But they obviously did a very good job. They have a lot of polling stations. There's 40,000 polling stations in the country. So from a management perspective, it's a little bit challenging to find enough people to go out and manage 40,000 individual polling stations. They don't really need that many. And that also leads to some voter confusion about where do you go and vote. The ministry introduced some new kind of high-tech tools that voters could go online and find out where they were registered, and it sort of looked good on the website, but it didn't really translate into helping people understand where they should go. And on election day, a lot of people had trouble finding their polling station. I think there was a lack of voter education, just the basic education that needs to be provided in any country, transitional country like this. There was confusion about the ballots. It was a very big, lengthy, complicated ballot. And we found that when people came into the polling station, they didn't quite understand how they were supposed to mark the ballot or what they were supposed to do. And in most countries, in many countries, there's information posted outside the polling station that shows a ballot and the ballot procedures. And there was really none of that. But nevertheless, you know, I think it was well managed. Some of the election officials in polling stations had disagreed on the procedures. You know, they weren't quite clear on how to do the count. It's a proportional representation system, a little bit more complicated. But even all of those little problems did not amount to enough to say that there was that the outcome would have been different. The PJD won, and to go to one of your points, you know, they're clearly the most organized political party in the country. We had briefings for 3 days before Election Day and had long meetings with almost every political party. And they were head and shoulders above their counterparts. They came in extremely organized, articulated their platforms, were able to go into great detail about what their plans would be, in contrast to the other parties who were still unable to really articulate their plans for the future. And on Election Day and in the days before, it was really the PJD that you saw out on the streets organizing. You really didn't see the other parties. So I think the fact that they won not only represents they are the only credible alternative, but they're also so much better organized than anybody else. The things that really disturbed us were as I mentioned before, the number of people who turned out. So I think the government was saying 45% is a great turnout. Well, it is, and it's, you know, we can't really speak about turnout here in the United States, but 45% of what? And this is where I think we should be a little bit concerned. Clearly, the number of registered voters was lower in 2011 than it was in 2007. I think it's a good guess that there are probably more people of voting age in 2011 than there was in 2007 with the huge youth bulge that exists there. When we met with the Ministry of Interior, we asked them how many eligible voters there were in the country, and they refused to answer that question and said that we would have to talk to the Census Bureau. And we thought that that was, really sort of ridiculous that the Ministry of Interior could not, they did not want to answer that question, I believe. Our thinking is that there are many, many people who should be registered and who should be motivated to vote. This was a very important election, and yet the numbers were low. In addition to that protest vote that we saw in at least the polling centers that our team observed, which was about 200 polling centers, a high number of invalid ballots, and many of them were protest ballots. People had come in, taken the time to go to their polling station and go in and vote and put either a big X across the entire ballot or to write an obscenity or to scribble on it. It was a protest vote. And that's quite unusual. I think there's a little bit of a history to that in Morocco, but the high numbers of those protest ballots, I think, was remarkable. The last thing I'd say is the February 20th group we met with, and we're very, very impressed with, I can't say their leadership because they don't really have a leadership, but with those who came to meet with us. And I do think they represent an important segment of society. They represent young potential voters, those who are looking for jobs, and those who I think are dissatisfied or skeptical of the reforms. The reform process in Morocco has been more of a top-down process than a grassroots process, and I think you can be critical of that, even though the reforms are quite good. I don't think there's been enough opportunity for civil society writ large to be involved in the discussion. And I think there are things that the government, that the palace and the new government can do to remedy that quite easily by just opening the doors a little bit wider so that people can come in and have a voice in a discussion about these reforms. And I think at the end of the day, that's probably the most important thing about these elections, is that not enough people really cast their ballots in favor of anything. More people want a voice in this discussion.
Very interesting, thank you. We're starting to run out of time, so I'm going to ask you to think about 1 minute comments. Bob?
Yeah, I just want to say that I think that if anything, this election comes across, given the turnout, as a condemnation, actually, of the political parties in Morocco. I think Moroccans are very politically interested and politically active. I mean, I was in Morocco during the 2009 communal elections, which were a lot more lively than these elections were in 2011. When people believe that they have something that actually is going to affect their daily lives, they get involved and participate. The other thing that I'd like to say about that is that one of the largest challenges, I think, to the political parties in Morocco is to find a way to look at and cooperate with the civil society organizations in that country as potential partners rather than as some kind of competition and organizations that they want to keep at arm's length because they're fearful that the energy and the vibrancy and the advocacy of the civil society groups is somehow going to upset the apple cart inside their own party structure, which would be a good thing if it did. But that relationship, I think, needs a lot of work on it.
Anwar?
Yeah, just in terms of the turnout, I mean, it's still low, better than expected. I mean, I spoke before and I thought there would be much, much more lower. But you're right. I mean, if you draw a distinction between the vote for the Constitution, that was a vote for the monarchy, as I stated, was clear. This vote was against political parties, and as you all know, political parties are holding extremely low esteem. I mean, something just prominent happened just before the vote, the monarch came to address Parliament. It's very famous, the debate about it throughout TV, and then a parliamentarian wanted to solicit the king's help, and he couldn't because of bodyguards, so he threw a letter at him. And that played out on TV over and over and over again. You know, again, it goes to discredit the political parties. Here's a parliamentarian in a parliament institution, and trying to ask the king for a favor. But that was a huge debate about it. But that's the stakes about this election, and that's why the PGD, I mean, must perform, and it must succeed, because if it doesn't, then you are absolutely right. I mean, it would contribute to the legitimization, I guess, of political process.
I strongly echo Sherry's points, and I think they're spot on. And you know, you look at the headlines and you see Moroccans turn out for election, but then when you look at 45%, 45% up from 37% in 2007 really is not a hugely significant difference. And if you look at Moroccan voting patterns out to the 70s and 80s, it was very much higher in the 60s and 70% range. So, you know, voting turnout has gone down over decades. And I think what's at play here are two things. First, I think the palace and the establishment needs to catch up with new forms of political activism. Youth no longer find parties to be very useful vehicles for expressing their concerns and grievances. That's partly because these civil society actors are not very civil, right, in terms of how they behave and how they're structured. But blogging, establishing NGOs, starting entrepreneurial organizations, Facebook, Twittering, those are new forms of activism and expression that I think mainstream political organizations and institutions the world over really have to catch up with and understand how to reach out and attract and inspire this new very important constituency, which would be youth. Also in terms of how political parties are structured, I think it was also mentioned earlier that it's not a very friendly environment. It's very difficult for women to make inroads because of entrenched practices. It's very difficult for youth or for younger members of parties also. And I think this is also the case even with the PJD and other Islamist parties in the region. They are led by older leadership. So I think a number of things have to happen. First, there has to be a new appreciation for the new kinds of political activism that are important to these new constituencies, and also there has to be an appreciation for the importance of internal reform of civil society organizations and political parties.
Thank you. Sherry, let me ask you a question. How did the youth fare in this whole thing? There's a set aside for youth. Was that good? Is that a good transitional step? How do you see the youth playing in this last election?
Well, I think that the set-aside seats, it's an important step right now, but I think the lack of youth participation, and that's something, again, that it's not captured in official data, but just from our observation, there weren't a lot of young people going to the polls, and I think that's the more challenging issue. And I wonder if at the end of the day, is this really going to be about, like it is in so many places, even here, the economy and jobs, and can these reforms and can this new government actually deliver something in that respect that's different from the last decade?
I don't know if things have changed since I've been there, but the whole lack of interest by the youth when I was there was in large part due to the arcaneness of the political parties. And I think they really have to, these political parties, as you're saying, have to really modernize and think about how youth is going to be an important part of their future. And we shall see, but hopefully this is a good beginning. Our last speaker is Bob Bahali, who was in Rabat when I was there. We served together. Bob's a 21-year veteran of the Foreign Service and also 2 tours in Vietnam as a helicopter pilot, which prepared him well for his job in Morocco. Bob, the question for you is the following. This has been a tough challenge for the U.S. Although the Arab Spring highlighted common issues among those countries affected, each country is clearly different, both in respect to its domestic political agenda and the relationship of the government and the people. Is there a way forward for the U.S., or are we better off letting local forces define their solutions for themselves?
Okay. Thanks, Ed. Maybe I should apologize to you in advance. I'm really only going to address one issue, but I think it's an important one for U.S. foreign policy because it goes to the heart of the issue of the will of the American people to be engaged in this process and the competence of the U.S. foreign policy establishment to do that in some kind of meaningful and positive way. We all know that Morocco's recent elections was only one in a continuing series of events in the Middle East and North Africa that's come to be known as the Arab Spring. What I mean to say is that the elections in Morocco did not occur in a vacuum, and we really can't begin to talk about the consequences for U.S. policy on the back of these elections without putting them in some larger regional context. What began as a kind of seemingly local process in Tunis suddenly mushroomed into something much bigger and sort of spread around the region like wildfire and became known, sort of the Arab equivalent of the shot heard around the world in the American Revolution. But where any of this is headed, I think, is really very difficult to say. I mean, we're in very uncharted waters here. What's clear is that the events in the region are not only going to have a very profound set of consequences for the politics of the region itself, but they're also going to have a very profound set of consequences for the United States and for our allies in Europe, and indeed for global politics as a whole. Having said that, I'm going to say something which you might think is a little provocative and say that I don't think that the Arab Spring could have come at a worse time. You might think I'm being provocative in that statement just for the sake of encouraging a little debate on the topic, but I'm actually quite serious about it. Of course, for the people of Tunisia and Libya and Egypt, they've gotten rid of Ben Ali and Gaddafi and Mubarak, and you might say that, well, that's a good thing in and of itself, and it probably is. But the question is, what comes next? Now, that's a very difficult question to answer. I mean, it continues there. I mean, look at the events that are ongoing in Syria and Iran, Bahrain, Yemen. The whole region is in a process of seismic change at the moment. And these changes are revolutionary. And revolutions, history has taught us, tend to turn out to be very messy, very chaotic, and more often than not, unfortunately, also very bloody. And just to take a couple of recent historical, well, not so recent, but a couple of historical examples as a reminder, the American Revolution.
Bob's youth.
Yeah, my youth, right. The American Revolution, which was not really a revolution at all, but a kind of rebellion, although it produced something which was very revolutionary, that is a constitutional republic, that revolution itself wasn't really finished in this country until after the American Civil War, when the contradictions and the dynamics that grew out of the founding of the country finally played themselves out in a bloody mess and helped put the country together again. I mean, the chaos and the bloodshed and the reign of terror that followed the French Revolution has been very well documented, and you can argue that that revolution took a better part of a century before it played itself out, and included a great deal of bloodshed throughout the continent of Europe. In both of these examples, what resulted was very much better than what was there to begin with, but that doesn't mean that we should discount and overlook the very heavy price that was paid in order to get from the beginning of those revolutions to the end of them. Can we expect today that the revolutions that are playing themselves out in the Middle East and North Africa are going to be any less messy, less chaotic, or less bloody than the ones that history has delivered up for us in the past? The kinds of fundamental political and social changes that are happening out there are clearly necessary. The regimes in the region have become so brittle, so deeply entrenched, so resistant to change, and so unresponsive to what are legitimate needs and demands from the people who live there, that unfortunately popular revolutions seem to be the only way left, at least the only way left that people think of, to get the changes that they're looking for. But if these changes are needed and indeed to be desired, why do I say they couldn't have come at a worse time? Well, I think the simple answer to that question is that are any of us really ready for them? You can argue that no one's ever ready for a revolution, but in life we also hope that we're learning something from our previous experiences, and we hope that we learn something from the experiences of our friends and neighbors, and that applies to us as individuals as well as to us, I think, as nations. And for me, the question today is, we know that events in the Middle East are going to have profound consequences for the region. We hope they're going to turn out well, but they could just as easily and perhaps even more easily turn out not so well. And that being the case, are we ready and are we willing to be helpful to our friends in the region that are facing these circumstances? And more importantly, do we know how to help them? My very real concern today is that we seem to be coming up short on both of these questions. Unless we find some new resolve here and our partners in Europe as well, for that matter, I'm afraid we're going to miss the opportunity to help shape revolutionary circumstances in the region in a way that benefits not only our own interests in the region, but the legitimate demands that are being asked by the societies in the region. To put it bluntly, I think it's pretty clear today that the American public has really grown tired of U.S. engagements in world conflicts and has been demanding the United States government to concentrate more on the domestic problems that we have at home, the economics that we're facing, the social injustice that we're still facing here, and to pay less attention to what's going on in the world around us. Not to be drawn into conflicts abroad, which we seem very constantly to be unable or unwilling to deliver the kinds of positive results on that politicians in both parties have sort of promised people. The failure of the U.S. and its foreign engagements, and especially, I think, in the Middle East and South Asia in the recent years, has increased a trend towards American withdrawal from global affairs that's been building up momentum for a very long time, stretching back indeed to Vietnam, when people began to get very skeptical about U.S. commitments abroad, and especially when those commitments were heavily military rather than heavily political. Can we reverse the trend? Okay, well, in my view, I don't think that's very likely. We've established by a set of repeated failures sort of our inability to deliver, not only in the eyes of the American public, but in this case, it's the view of people in the Middle East themselves, that the United States has not been a reliable partner for them in trying to bring about the kinds of positive changes in their lives that they've been looking for. I had a friend of mine just the other day, former ambassador to Morocco, not Ed, who sent me an email, and in that email there was a picture of a bumper sticker that he had seen on somebody's car, and it said, "Be nice to America, or we'll bring democracy to your country." Okay? You know, I mean, just you know, the kind of reaction that you have to a statement like that speaks volumes, not only to perceptions of people here in the United States, but the perceptions of people in the region themselves about the United States and its engagement in the region. Yeah, okay. And unless we can reverse that kind of trend, I don't think our prospects for helping to be a positive influence on events in the region are really very good. We're here to talk about Morocco, okay? So I'm going to step out on the line. I'm going to step out on a limb here and say that, you know, what the U.S. needs to do in order to begin to reverse this kind of trend is to have some successes, okay? And Morocco, I believe, offers us an opportunity to have a success in a way that will begin to persuade people here at home and perhaps people in the region that the United States can be counted on to be a reliable partner to stand beside people who are in fact trying to get it right and are demonstrating their own commitment to the process of getting it right in a positive way. Morocco, in a sense here, fortunately I think for Moroccans, and fortunately, hopefully, for the U.S. government and for the American people, is kind of low-hanging fruit. These are people that have already been at this process of reform for 2 decades and have already demonstrated the political willingness to push this process forward, and an opportunity for the United States to stand behind that process in a very visible and tangible kind of way and to show that the U.S. can be effective and can help people achieve these kinds of goals without the violence and the chaos that they're looking, that have been the consequences elsewhere. Unless we're able to do that, I don't think that we're going to have very much positive impact in the region, and we won't be able to persuade the people in this country that U.S. foreign policy can in fact deliver on goals in the region.
Thank you, Bob. As my colleague, he was given 3 extra minutes.
I tend to be
Anwar, would
wordy.
you like to make a comment or ask a question?
Well, just quickly, I mean, you're right. I mean, revolutions come at worse times. I mean, sure, especially economic times, but probably without the economic turmoil in the world, without these recessions, probably there wouldn't have been these revolutions. So you're right, it's twofold. Probably without the recession, there wouldn't have been a revolution. But it would have been preferable, for example, especially not just in the case of Morocco, but also in Egypt and Tunisia, if there was something akin to the Marshall Plan. Because in the end, I mean, these governments will be judged on economics. I mean, there was a poll just released yesterday in Tunisia, same thing. Obviously, there are problems with governance, but also socioeconomics, and they have to deliver quickly. For Morocco, you're right. I mean, the United States needs success stories, and Morocco can be one. And that's why it needs all the assistance it can get. Morocco is critical because it's probably the last case or last hope we have to demonstrate that actually top-down reforms work. Because if they fail, then to bring reforms, probably you should look at other alternatives. Now we have really 2 ways to go about doing the reforms. It's either revolutions or cooperative transition, what we call in theory pacted transitions. So if they fail in Morocco, then probably they can't succeed in Morocco. They won't succeed in Jordan because Jordan is following Morocco very closely, and there is pressure on the king to move as well. In fact, that's one of the demands in the street, is that he should be he should follow the monarch of Morocco. So that's where I see Morocco is hugely significant, because it presents a model for other monarchies. Morocco moves forward, Jordan follows, and then hopefully the Gulf. And we have seen some stirrings in the Gulf as well, with Qatar, Saudi Arabia, women voting in 2015. That might be baby steps, but still, given the Gulf and the traditions and cultural differences between the two, it's significant. That's why Morocco, in my view, is hugely significant that it succeeds.
We shouldn't miss this opportunity. Audra.
Yes, I agree. Transitions are messy. I think we've assumed that, if we have democratization or liberalization prior to democratization, this is somehow going to diminish the likelihood of violence and unrest and instability. And we've seen anything but, of course, in these transition processes, because certain, grievances and interests are brought to the fore in ways that are very difficult for governments to control. But I think this comes at a time of diminished U.S. credibility as well. And our leverage in the region, I think, as we all know, is low. And so we have to be very creative, and also, I think, very careful with how we approach, interact, and deal with actors and with the sorts of policies that we put forward. I think, traditionally, as Anwar said, well, not traditionally, but as Anwar said, it is about the economy. I think for a lot of for these newer governments, and their ability to survive in a second election will depend on economic performance. So I think a challenge for the U.S. and an opportunity for the U.S. is to improve economic conditions, but not through traditional trade policies. We always put forth trade. Well, I think in the context of Morocco and even Tunisia, more entrepreneurial sorts of strategies that encourage smaller types of businesses and more innovative types of businesses that don't depend on trade, I think are going to be very important. So I think that is an opportunity for the U.S. as well, is to think beyond the standard, improving trade and liberalizing trade sorts of policies.
Actually on that point, Secretary Clinton has announced this new U.S. North Africa Economic Opportunity Partnership, NAPIO, which very much plays to the entrepreneurship in the private sector for North African countries. We hope that they can put the muscle behind and the resources behind this in your words, a creative approach. Sherry, would you like to make a comment?
I agree with what everyone has said. I think this is a tremendous opportunity for the United States. I don't think achieving success in Morocco will require as much economic effort on behalf of the United States as, say, Tunisia or Egypt or some of these other places that are going through a transition. I think a lot can be done to show legitimate support to the citizens of Morocco, to this new political leadership in the country. I think we need to continue to push the reform efforts and to make sure that there's not a complacency with the status quo right now. There was an interesting article in today's Washington Post op-ed about Obama's relationship with Erdogan in Turkey. And I think that working with Turkey, particularly since the PGD is talking about how it sort of identifies itself a little bit with the Turkish parties, could be another important relationship or angle to develop a deeper relationship with Turkey and some of these countries in North Africa. But I think it is low-hanging fruit. I think we deserve, we should indeed put every effort we have forward, and I don't think it necessarily needs to cost this government, or the U.S. government, a lot of money to do so.
Yeah, when you look across the region, you start to see certain countries emerging as potential real anchors and leaders, Turkey being one, Morocco, Jordan, and even Saudi, when you consider the power of Saudi and its preeminence in the Islamic world. So it's a very interesting new dynamic that's going on among countries that perhaps weren't in the lead. Egypt used to be in the lead, but now we're in Qatar's coming. UAE can't be underestimated. So anyway, with that, we've got about a half an hour for questions and or comments. I'm going to ask you to limit it to 1 minute. I'll have to cut you off, so we really would like to avoid very long comments. Please identify yourself, and we're going to give you the microphone. This gentleman was first.
Good afternoon, or morning. My name is Joel Teitelbaum. I'm a scholar of the Maghreb, and I would like just to mention two things.
Joel, is his mic on?
Can you hear me?
Yes, it's on.
I'll
Okay.
talk louder.
No, it's on. Sorry.
I represent, I represent, or at least am from the Fulbright Association. 1 minute. Give me the 1 minute now.
Okay.
For Mr. Anwar Bukhara, and maybe not for the rest of you, because I have a distinct impression that you're all Middle East Sharq oriented. And Morocco is actually not part of the Middle East geographically, culturally, or in many other ways. It's middle southwest of Europe. In other words, Mediterranean, Atlantic. It's actually part of North Africa. And the political attempt to put it into the MENA, to put it into the context of Jordan, Saudi Arabia, etc., is so anathema to the way Moroccans live that I'm quite astounded that everybody talks that way. I'd like Mr. Bukhara, if possible, to give us a better sense of a Morocco which is not Arab, but has an Arabic-speaking dominant culture, which is largely Berber, let's say Tamazight, Shilha, and which, in terms of population, the Shilha, the Amazigh will soon be the majority population once again, if given a chance and not suppressed. Can you give us back a context of that in relation to Spain, France, and the rest of the world without reference to all kinds of idealistic American misconceptions? Thank you.
I'm going to ask you to hold on the answer. Remember it. He'll take
thank
it
you.
behind
Appreciate it. Thank you.
And I'm going to ask a few questions. Come up, and then we'll answer them together. Is there another question? Someone? Yes, ma'am.
Not really. You're asking for new questions.
Any question you'd like to ask? Yes.
Hi. Thank you very much for your conversations. My name is Pamela Beecroft. I am the program officer at the Center for International Private Enterprise, which is one of the sister institutions with NDI under the National Endowment for Democracy. My question is actually pretty basic. We've talked, there have been mentions of civil society and voice and participation. As someone who writes proposals with that kind of language all the time, it's a very nice sort of term, but I'm wondering if some of you, any of you, can give examples of how you see that kind of, in terms of processes, real processes, how you see participation, voice, civil society inclusion really playing out in a way that satisfies both political parties' needs for sort of substantive and diverse voices, and the ability of civil society to feel heard, and the ability for citizens to feel like they're heard by civil society. Because I think sometimes civil society can make up its own sort of segment without necessarily reference to populations that technically they're distilling the voices of.
I can tell they really like your question. Everybody's writing it down. I'm going to take one more, and then we'll go through a round of answers.
Hi, my name is Sana Boutayeb. I'm from Morocco. I'm a communication specialist. I have a question for Mr. Anwar. You mentioned that most people voted for the PGD because it's something new. But I'm just wondering, aren't they known for the grassroots work? And also, do they have a track record? Because we can't just say people voted for them because it's something new. Also, in terms of definition, we say, we keep saying or saying that it's an Islamist party, and it sounds more like a concern than anything. Isn't it an oxymoron to have an Islamist party, to call it Islamist party in a Muslim country? Can we just clear that, boogeyman thing? Thanks.
Questions. I'm going to go to Anwar because at least two of the questions seem to be directed right at him. Even though I'm not a MENA expert, I think that Anwar can answer both the first and third question at least, if not all three.
I'm sure, and the panel is also as qualified to speak to that. To your question, you're right. I mean, Morocco is a melange of different influences, but I think it would be wrong not to characterize or not to see it as also as Arab. Sure, but remember, just look at the protests. I mean, the protests started in Tunisia, and they just limited themselves, to the Middle East. What occurred in Tunisia, and it spread to Egypt, and then it came with some limited forms to Morocco, is that there is some resonance out there for the socioeconomic grievances. And many ways. I mean, if you look at I don't want to go there, the Palestinian issue, for example, when Moroccans take to the streets to support self-determination. So I think it would be wrong not to see it as Arab as well. But you're right, it's all of what you mentioned. I mean, it is, I don't know what the percentage of Berbers in there, but it depends. I mean, it can be 40, it can be 60, but in fact, it's a mixture of all. Myself,
Because
my dad is...
Sure. They don't tell you what.
Okay,
let
him answer.
Yeah,
please.
that's my exam. I mean, my dad is Berber, my mom is Arab. So you're right. I mean, it's throughout. Sure, but you're right. So that I think it is, whether if it's not wholly Arab, but it is at least part Arab. For the PGD question, you're absolutely right. I mean, there is a track record. In fact, there is. Look at Parliament. I mean, it's one of the most disciplined party that has been there. Obviously, it didn't have the ability to govern. And prior to the Constitution, the legislature was limited in what it could do. But they have demonstrated that that they are serious about what they do. unlike the other parties, and as you probably know, they have enjoyed, in fact, throughout their tenure since 1998, of embarrassing the other parties by, for example, taking attendance sheets. That's just one example among many. There is also another track record in governance because they had mayorships. They have been mayor in several cities, and there the record obviously is quite mixed. In Meknes, they had some trouble, but generally, is that their brand is, it's not because Islam is their brand, but it's just they are viewed as non-corrupt for now. And they will bring some accountability to the system. For your question, is an Islamist party? Sure, it's an oxymoron. And the PGD, they don't refer to themselves as such. They say Islam is just a reference. That's all there is in terms of value. So you're right, probably we shouldn't call them Islamist party. That's why they call themselves the party of justice and development. They had to because the constitution stipulates it anyway. And I'll just stop. I know people have more expertise.
Anybody want to answer any of the three questions?
Yeah, I'll take a couple of them, actually. I'll reference to all three. With the first question regarding Morocco's place in the world and its identity, I would argue that it has a Berber identity, it has an Arab identity, a Jewish identity, as well as an African identity. And it's not just Mediterranean or Atlantic. So I think it's a number of different identities, and I think Moroccans recognize that. I taught at Al-Ahwayn, and I actually posed this question to my students, all Moroccan, and this is how they answered. I mean, they said we are a number of identities, and we affiliate and embrace a number of different regions and cultures. It's really complicated, and Morocco is special. So I think there is a broad recognition, and I think it is unique. In terms of the political events that are happening in the region, however, I think Morocco does relate to what's going on in the Gulf and does relate to what's going on in the Levant as well from a political perspective. So that's why we cast Morocco also in the context of what's going on in the broader Middle East as well. Pamela, going back to your question about civil society, when I think of civil society, I first think of whether or not institutions themselves are civil in terms of their behavior. Do they have procedures and mechanisms for succession and for nominating candidates of the voices that they claim to represent? Are they transparent? And do they disseminate information in a way that's egalitarian? Do they have forums and venues for discussions and debates and these sorts of things? So when I think of first civil society, I don't think of civil society in terms of whether or not actors are involved. That's secondary. To me, what's also important and what's a priority is how organizations behave themselves. The Islamist question, I might be overgeneralizing, but Anwar, as a scholar and as a major organization representative, Sherry, Islamism or Islamist was kind of a label that academics and observers adopted to label and categorize different types of parties. It's very simple. It's not necessarily the way that people might describe themselves as members of these parties, but I would agree with Anwar. It was just kind of a category that's shorthand for something much more complex.
Let me, as we go through this, I'm going to have to hold you to 1 minute. I'm sorry, because we want to get as many questions out as we can. Sherry.
Just 2 quick points on civil society. I think there's a lot that can be done that's very simple, that's been done all over the world. Really, it's just finding a forum for citizens groups, NGOs, unions, everybody that's sort of not in government to have a chance to talk about this stuff. And that can be done through a variety of mechanisms. I don't think it's that hard. I think the government should take note right now and try to do that. And I don't think they have anything to fear. As the ambassador said, King has a high approval rating. People support this, but I think they want to be more involved. On the Islamist issue, we were just talking about this at the office yesterday. I think we're trying to get our hands around this thing here in the United States right now. And we don't, we're very naive, I think. The press is naive about who these parties are and what they stand for. And in fact, as you pointed out, the PGD is really more like a Christian Democratic Party. I mean, they have a basis in their faith, but they're like free trade. I think they're more sort of conservative in the way they would want to run government than basing it off of the Quran. So I think
Exactly.
the press is using that label. I think it's going to unfold, and I think we're going to start talking about this in more detail as we go forward with these elections around the region.
Bob?
I'm going to leave the other two questions alone, but I do want to come to this issue about civil society and echo something that you said earlier about innovation, because I think this is really important and a key to success in the region. With Ed's kind support, while we were in Morocco together at the embassy, one of the things that we did out there was to start a small grants program. It took an enormous amount of persuasion to get the State Department to agree to do this and to find a mechanism for doing it. But it's a very innovative and extremely effective way to reach out and give civil society groups that are doing advocacy, both for political reform or social reforms, a direct voice by making grants anywhere from like $5,000 to $25,000 and resisting putting our own label on it so that it doesn't get labeled as a U.S. program. But it allows you to with that kind of grant program, which can be modestly funded, to reach out and touch a whole broad segment of the society, that's trying to support these kinds of reforms, whether it's working on implementation for women's rights in rural areas, or whether it's the pursuit of one of the things we did, was do a comic book on human rights that wound up getting used in a curriculum, and doing a play about a divorce proceeding that was put on by a women's theater group. These kind of things can have huge impacts at small costs, but the government, our government, and frankly, the instruments of a democratization and governance programs that our government supports, needs to be willing to adjust their own program priorities and activities to embrace these kinds of innovative ways and get them to go forward. We failed entirely in persuading others in the region to adopt this kind of approach, even though when the Second Intifada began out in Palestine, and everybody else was shut off from dialogue with their political contacts and civil society. In Morocco, we were able to continue to talk to people about events because we had been reaching out to them in this kind of concrete way.
Okay, thanks, Bob. I'm going to try to take some more questions. We have an electronic question that's come in, correct? Do that first.
Hi, thank you. Sarah Parker from Grayling. And I have a question from a journalist who's based in Beirut, who writes for The Independent, who some of you have spoken with. He's done some coverage on the election. He has a follow-up question. I've heard the 45% figure from the group this morning, and his question is specifically, what was the turnout like in the Western Sahara, and as much information as you can give on the voting districts there and what the turnout was like.
Yeah, and who is the reporter?
I'm sorry, his name is Joseph Dyke.
Okay, I think I've talked to Joe before. Unfortunately, the breakdowns are not out yet. Maybe Anwar has more than I do, but I do know when you look across the board at the Sahara, it was over 65% turnout rate. So it was much higher than the average, which has been the tradition, by the way, there. It was lower in Dakhla than Laayoune, but overall, I think it was 50% in Dakhla, over 70% in Laayoune, and about 65% was the average throughout the region, which is an interesting comment when it comes to the question of regionalization and how politically active the people of the Sahara are in terms of supporting this constitution and its changes.
I just want to add, I was in Dakhla for the 2009 communal elections, and as I suggested earlier, participation in those elections was much higher than it was in this election, although it was consistent with voter turnout and voter participation in the process in the southern provinces, as it has been all along.
Right.
You have very high turnout there.
Okay, other questions? Jane?
Yes. There's a comment in the there's a little blurb in the handouts about the Western Sahara. Could any of you comment on the impact of the Western Sahara dispute that this election might have?
Sure, that's one question. I know Bob's going to have an opinion on that. Another question?
Hi, my name is Human Saberi. I work at Chemonics International, and I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Morocco from 2006 to 2008. During my time there, I could see firsthand some of the political and economic frustrations that the youth were facing. So I was wondering if you could each elaborate a little bit more on the youth, sort of what do you think their role is moving forward, and whether they'll be sort of successfully incorporated into the discourse that's going on. Thanks.
Another question, yes, sir?
Hi, my name is Ahmed Achuji. I would like to just go back to something that Sherry mentioned, which deals specifically with what does 45% mean, the question that was posed to Interior Minister, and how that question was sort of evaded. For somebody who spends every day looking at numbers and trying to see what they mean, I'm trained to question the assumptions before I look at the conclusions. So I really think you can push this process a lot faster by really asking those kinds of questions, because you really want people to trust the process. And if the numbers mean something different than what it is advertised to mean, then you're really shooting yourself in the foot, and you will help this process move forward. The second thing is, I really hope that somebody would comment on what the upper bound is in terms of expectations from the standpoint of how the process is set up, and the fact that the PGD only went by 107 out of 395 and not 200. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll take probably just one more, and I apologize, and then we'll answer them. Okay. Let me ask that we have some lead on this. I'm going to take a shot at the Sahara question, Jane. And I'm sure Bob will want to say something. I'm going to ask Sherry to address the youth question. And on the upper bound expectations, I think Sherry and Anwar and all of you could join in. And we'll keep it to 1 minute, Bob. On the Sahara, I think the biggest change post-Constitution for the Sahara is the regionalization plan. I think it's going to be very important as the country devolves power. Think about this. The King of Morocco is pushing for a constitution that devolves power from the top. Mm-hmm. That in itself is a very strong and quite amazing comment in itself. So how that evolves to the Sahara will be interesting, because as you know, the international community now is proposing a solution to the Sahara that would involve Morocco's sovereignty with autonomy in the region. And it's something that His Majesty, the King of Morocco, and the Moroccan people, as well as the international community now, are coalescing around. If that regionalization meets international standards for autonomy, it will have a profound effect on the final solution to the Sahara.
Just to add to the Sahara issue, look, the people in the Polisario have been pushing the point of view that they are the sole representative of the Sahrawi people. At least that's their self-proclamation, okay? Despite the fact that here you have a group of people that have had the same president and haven't had a meaningful election in better than 3 decades, okay? The people who actually live in the Sahara, the majority of the population down there, has been given repeated opportunities to go to the polls and to express their satisfaction or dissatisfaction with the national arrangement in which they live and with who it is they think ought to be running affairs locally. Despite calls, repeated calls from the Polisario leadership for people to boycott these elections, and indeed pleas from the Polisario to the Security Council to ensure that Morocco doesn't allow the people in the Sahara to even go to the polls and express their opinion. Despite all of that, people in the Sahara have gone to the polls in record numbers, and have voted for their own national representatives and their own local leadership, and have demonstrated fairly conclusively in that process, I think, over at least the last decade, that they're committed to an arrangement in which they're currently living, and presumably committed to the kinds of promises that are being made to them and how they will be able to live their lives in the future and completely rejecting, the alternative which is being offered to them by the Polisario's leadership. I think that speaks volumes by itself.
Jane, I'm sure Bob's very happy you asked that question. Sherry, would you take on the youth question?
On the youth question, NDI carried out focus groups of youth perceptions of the reform process in Morocco in July, and I think it's an interesting read. It's on our website, www.ndi.org, and it really reflects everything that we've been talking about today, that youth are in favor of reforms, but they're skeptical, and they're worried that they're not going to go far enough. They are dissatisfied with political parties, and what they really want this reform process to focus on is education, jobs, and an end to corruption. So I think, again, I just keep reiterating the same thing. I think that there is a youth movement out there that's a little bit disenfranchised, has not quite bought in, should be brought into the tent for more constructive engagement. They have strong views, and they want this guy. I think that they want this reform process to succeed, but they also want a job, and they want to go to school.
Anwar, would you take on the question of the upper bound expectations of the PJD and this political process that was asked?
Oh, that's just the West Sahara quickly. I've been there. I did several interviews. What really just pops up is the question of governance. I mean, it's the same problems that exist in the interior of Morocco. There's a serious problem of governance, and people are driven by local concerns, and that's why they go to vote. Importantly, the PJD, I think, won a seat or two in the Western Sahara. That's unthinkable. Unthinkable, and I'm one of those that was stunned by that. The PJD doesn't do well in the rural areas at all. They did pretty well this time, and also in the Western Sahara, and that tells you exactly what drives people's concerns. It's governance, governance, governance. So that's for that. The expectations obviously are high, the PJD. I mean, even those that don't vote for the PJD, I mean, they hope that they will practice what they preach, that they will bring more, as I said, accountability, because that's really what matters, that they will contribute to the independence of the judiciary. If you saw in the last few days, they had celebrations in Tangier and Fez and elsewhere, in which tens of thousands of their supporters came, and one of the chants was Istiqlal al-Qada, independence of the judiciary. I mean, you hear tens of thousands of people just saying it and saying it again. So that's where the expectations are, and whether they can deliver or not, that we shall see how it plays out. But there are expectations out there, and there are a lot of the silent majority still skeptical, support the monarchy, but it just don't know how this process will go.
Thank you so much. Audra, you can do the wrap-up. You'll have the last shot here.
Great. I just wanted to add...
In 1 minute.
Wanted to add to Sherry's always excellent comments on youth. Something that I didn't mention, and I think that deserves attention here, is it's just not, for youth in Morocco, it's not just about jobs and employment and earning a living. Some early research that I was involved in earlier this year also, I was reminded, emphasized that youth want to be respected. They want to be valued. They want to be taken seriously. They don't want to be treated like children. So there's a whole they want a purpose. There's a whole element of self-fulfillment and the sense of being useful and the sense of being part of something important and something enduring that I think also drives youth attitudes and their frustration, that sense that not only do they not have access to jobs and economic opportunity and political opportunity, but rather just as people in Morocco, they're not appreciated and they're overlooked and they're just marginalized as human beings, as young human beings because of their age. So going forward, I think that also deserves attention, and we should always be mindful of that as well.
Well, I'd like to thank Anwar. I know you came quite a ways to be with us, and as always, you're a superstar at these functions. Audra, thank you. Sherry, thanks for being with us. Bob, thank you very much. And thank you to all of you for coming and participating.